Somewhere in Kingston Harbor tonight, a crane the height of a 20-story building is lifting steel into place under floodlights because the work cannot stop for darkness. Somewhere outside Montego Bay, engineers are pouring concrete for the longest 4-lane bridge this country has ever built, racing a construction window measured in months, not years. And somewhere above both cities, in boardrooms in London, in Miami, in Beijing, airline executives and shipping analysts are quietly recalculating what Jamaica is actually capable of. This is not a story about potholes getting patched or a terminal getting a fresh coat of paint. This is a story about a small island nation making a calculated multi-billion-dollar bet on its own future, betting that if you build the runways long enough, the ports deep enough, and the roads wide enough, the world's cargo, capital, and travelers will follow. Most people living within a few miles of these construction sites have no real sense of what is actually being built around them or why. Most visitors flying in and out of Jamaica's airports have no idea that the ground beneath their feet, the runway, the taxiway, the terminal floor, is part of a coordinated national strategy years in the making. 10 projects are driving that strategy. Some of them you may have heard whispers about, a headline here, a budget figure there. Most of them, even people who work adjacent to these industries, have never seen laid out together, in sequence, as the single interconnected story they actually are. By the end of this, you will understand exactly why a 5-megawatt solar farm at an airport matters just as much as a runway extension. You will understand why a stretch of taxiway that most passengers will never consciously notice is quietly worth millions of dollars a year to the country's economy. You will understand why a 2.5-kilometer stretch of new highway can move the needle on a tourism sector employing hundreds of thousands of people. And you will understand why the final project on this list, the cheapest of them all by a wide margin, may be the single project holding every other billion-dollar ambition together. The one piece of concrete and pipe that everything else quietly depends on. We are also not going to pretend this is a story without risk. Projects of this size, financed through public money, private capital, and international lending, carry real exposure, and we will get into exactly where that exposure sits before we're done. Small nations that make bets this large do not always win them. The Caribbean's own history is full of half-finished terminals, roads that stalled halfway through a budget cycle when political priorities shifted, and ports that never attracted the vessels their original planners promised nervous investors. Jamaica's own planners are acutely aware of that history, and so should we be as we walk through exactly what is being built here and what it will take to actually finish it. But first, the countdown. Before we begin, if infrastructure stories like this hold your attention, this channel is working toward 10,000 subscribers. And every one of you watching right now is genuinely part of getting there. It costs nothing, and it tells us there is an audience for the kind of research most channels simply don't take the time to do. Now let's get into it. Number 10. The Montego Bay Perimeter Road. $274 million, cutting through the most commercially valuable terrain on Jamaica's north coast. A stretch of land where every acre touches tourism, agriculture, or trade in some form. For decades, Montego Bay has run on a contradiction that anyone who has ever tried to get from the airport to a resort during peak season understands instinctively. It is the beating heart of Jamaica's tourism economy, the first Jamaican skyline most visitors ever see, and yet the road network feeding it has remained fundamentally unchanged, while the volume of people, vehicles, and cargo moving through it has multiplied several times over. Every roundabout became a choke point. Every intersection near the airport became a place where a 15-minute transfer could quietly stretch into an hour, where a delivery truck carrying produce for a resort kitchen could sit idling behind a queue of taxis and tour buses, burning fuel and losing daylight. Tourism economists have a specific term for this kind of friction. They call it leakage, the slow, largely invisible bleed of revenue and goodwill that happens when a destination cannot move people and goods efficiently, even when everything else about that destination, the beaches, the resorts, the hospitality, is genuinely working. The Perimeter Road is an attempt to close that leak permanently, not incrementally. Stretching more than 15 kilometers, the corridor is anchored by Jamaica's longest 4-lane bridge, spanning the Montego River, engineered not just to look impressive but to survive decades of heavy use without the structural fatigue that has shortened the lifespan of older Jamaican bridges. The Long Hill Bypass section incorporates drainage systems built specifically for the intensity of Caribbean tropical rainfall, the kind of downpour that has historically shut down roads for days, stranded communities, and turned routine commutes into logistical emergencies. This is not decorative engineering added for the sake of a press release. Jamaica has learned, often at real cost to businesses and residents, exactly what happens when infrastructure is designed for an average day instead of the worst one the climate can produce. Traffic modeling on the completed corridor projects, travel time reductions approaching 40% on the busiest routes, feeding the resort areas and the airport. That is not an abstract statistic buried in an engineering report. It is the difference between a cruise passenger making a shore excursion and missing it entirely, between a delivery truck completing 3 runs a day instead of 2, between a wedding party arriving on time or arriving flustered and behind schedule. It is the difference between an economy that moves at the speed of its infrastructure and one that is constantly apologizing for the gap between what it promises tourists and what its roads can actually deliver. What makes this project significant is not simply the dollar figure attached to it. It is the underlying signal it sends that Montego Bay is finally being treated not as a postcard destination to be marketed, but as an economic engine that has quietly outgrown its own arteries and needed this upgrade for a generation. Consider what a highway corridor like this has already done for competing destinations elsewhere in the region, where similar projects shaved real percentage points off tourism leakage within a few years of completion, turning congestion complaints into a genuine selling point for repeat visitors. Jamaica is not inventing this playbook, it is finally executing on it after watching competitors move first. And while that engine gets rebuilt on the ground, an entirely different transformation has been unfolding in Kingston's sky, one with consequences that reach far beyond the capital. Number 9. The Norman Manley International Airport runway extension. 300 meters of new pavement, more than 19,000 square meters of expanded surface area. $72 million spent to remove a constraint that has quietly shaped Jamaica's global position for years, without most Jamaicans ever realizing it existed. Here is the constraint most travelers never think about, and most policymakers understand all too well. Runway length is not a matter of convenience, it is a hard mathematical ceiling. A runway that falls short of a certain threshold makes it physically impossible for long-haul aircraft, the wide-body jets flying non-stop from Europe or Asia, to operate safely with a full payload of passengers, cargo, and fuel. For years, that ceiling meant Kingston's own capital city airport was effectively locked out of direct long-haul service, forcing both travelers and cargo through connecting hubs in Miami, Panama, or further afield. Every one of those connections added cost. Every connection added hours to journey that should have been direct. Every connection was revenue, and often goodwill, that landed somewhere else first, in someone else's airport, someone else's economy. The extension does not simply add length to a runway, it adds possibility to an entire national aviation strategy. Built alongside it are advanced runway and safety areas, engineered systems designed to absorb an aircraft overrun and prevent what could otherwise become a catastrophic accident, a feature that reflects an operational philosophy built around genuine precision rather than the bare minimum a regulator requires. Airlines do not choose new international routes emotionally or based on tourism board marketing. They run exhaustive financial models weighing fuel burn, aircraft range, crew costs, and yes, runway length against projected passenger demand and expected yield. Models that can take months to finalize and that route planning teams revisit constantly as fuel prices and competitive pressures shift beneath them. When a runway crosses the specific threshold that makes those models finally work in an airport's favor, that airport shifts into an entirely different category, one where destinations that were previously financially unreachable will suddenly become viable for the first time in the airline's history. What is easy to overlook about this particular project is its timeline and the philosophy embedded inside it. This runway was not built for the traffic Kingston sees today, on a typical Tuesday afternoon. It was built for the traffic a transformed Jamaica is projected to generate 5, 10, 20 years from now, embedding a genuine bet on the country's own long-term trajectory directly into reinforced concrete. That kind of long-horizon thinking rarely makes headlines because it produces no immediate visible reward, no ribbon-cutting moment that photographs well. but it is exactly the kind of decision that ultimately determines whether a country's infrastructure ages gracefully into relevance or becomes obsolete the very moment it opens to the public. There is also a quieter economic multiplier hiding inside this project. Direct long-haul routes do not just move tourists more efficiently. They move higher-spending business travelers, diaspora visitors flying home for extended stays, and time-sensitive cargo. All categories of traffic that connecting flights systematically discourage simply through the friction of an extra layover. A single new non-stop route can be worth many times its own operating cost in downstream tourism and trade revenue over a decade. And on the other side of the island, the terminal meant to actually receive that anticipated wave of new long-haul arrivals is undergoing a parallel transformation of its own. Number 8. The Sangster International Airport expansion. Between 2026 and 2030, as much as $180 million will pour into Montego Bay's primary aviation gateway, and the airport that emerges on the other side of that investment will barely resemble the one operating today. Expanded arrivals lounges designed to handle a substantially larger volume of simultaneous international flights. New gates along an entirely new East Concourse. Modernized customs processing built around faster document verification and reduced wait times. Upgraded baggage handling systems capable of processing a volume of luggage the current infrastructure was simply never designed to absorb, not even on its busiest imagined day. Each element of this expansion targets a specific choke point, the exact points in the passenger journey where Sangster's physical limitations have quietly capped how many tourists Jamaica's hotel sector can actually receive, regardless of how many new resort rooms get built or how aggressively the destination gets marketed abroad. You can build 1,000 new hotel rooms, but if the airport receiving those guests cannot physically process them without hours of delay, the investment in those rooms is undermined at the exact first point of contact. In an industry as fiercely competitive as Caribbean tourism, where destinations are often interchangeable in a traveler's mind until the moment of actual booking, the difference between a smooth, efficient arrival and a delayed, congested one compounds in ways that are easy to underestimate. Multiply that difference across millions of passengers moving through a single airport every year, and it becomes a measurable, trackable factor in whether travelers choose Jamaica over a competing island destination the very next time they book a vacation. Airlines and travel agents notice these patterns even when individual tourists don't consciously register why one destination feels smoother than another. And those patterns eventually show up in which islands get promoted harder in glossy vacation packages and which quietly get deprioritized in favor of a competitor offering the same beaches with fewer arrival headaches. What rarely makes it into public discussion about this expansion is a quieter, more strategic layer sitting underneath the tourism narrative. New access roads and dedicated facilities are being built specifically for private and business aviation, a category of traveler entirely distinct from the commercial tourist flow. Executives, investors, and high-value travelers whose absolute numbers are small but whose economic footprint per arrival is disproportionately large compared to the average vacationing family. Designing infrastructure specifically around that category is a deliberate, calculated bet on Jamaica's role not merely as a place people vacation once, but as a place people conduct business, deploy capital, and return to repeatedly over years. As Sangster's overall capacity approaches nearly double its current throughput, Montego Bay's claim to being Jamaica's dominant air gateway stops being a marketing aspiration and starts becoming something closer to architectural, structural fact. It is worth pausing on just how unusual it is for a mid-sized regional airport to plan for a doubling of capacity in a single coordinated phase, rather than the incremental, decade-by-decade expansions most airports of its size actually pursue. That decision alone tells you how confident Jamaica's planners are that the demand will genuinely materialize, and how much is riding on that confidence proving justified. Number 7. The Norman Manley Airport apron reconstruction. $53 million to replace more than 100,000 square meters of the surface where aircraft actually park, refuel, and prepare for departure, the unglamorous concrete that almost no passenger ever consciously registers. The math behind this particular project is blunt, and the urgency behind it is equally blunt. Roughly 2 million passengers move through Norman Manley every single year, and behind every one of those passengers sits an entire sequence of aircraft movements, fueling operations, maintenance cycles, and ground logistics that all depend, in the most literal sense, on the structural integrity of the pavement sitting directly beneath the aircraft. That pavement, the apron, had reached the genuine end of its operational life, functioning as an invisible ceiling on how much the airport could actually grow, no matter how many new routes or runway improvements existed elsewhere in the system. You can extend a runway all you want, you can attract every long-haul route in the world, but if the aircraft using that runway have nowhere structurally sound to park, refuel, and turn around safely, the value of that runway extension is capped from below, quietly and visibly, before a single new route ever launches. The reconstruction specifies high-durability concrete formulated specifically for Jamaica's tropical climate, engineered to withstand intense heat, torrential seasonal rainfall, and the sheer mechanical stress of increasingly large commercial aircraft cycling through the same surface multiple times a day, every day, for decades, without the cracking and surface degradation that ordinary concrete mixes develop far sooner under those exact conditions. The design target is minimal maintenance downtime, which translates in very practical terms into fewer unexpected closures, more predictable scheduling for every airline operating out of Kingston, and an operating environment that carriers can actually commit long-term route contracts to with genuine confidence. This is infrastructure that virtually no passenger will ever consciously notice or think to thank, and yet it is felt, quietly, in every single flight that manages to depart on schedule instead of sitting delayed on the tarmac. Airlines that operate into airports with unreliable apron surfaces quietly build extra buffer time into their published schedules to cover for the risk. And that buffer time shows up, year after year, as a small but permanent tax on how competitive a route actually looks on paper compared to a rival destination. Removing that tax, even by a matter of minutes per flight, compounds across tens of thousands of flights a year into a genuine reputational asset. And connecting that newly reconstructed apron to the runways themselves is a project just as unglamorous on paper, and just as consequential in practice. Number 6. The Norman Manley Airport Taxiway Rehabilitation. $10 million, covering the taxiways designated Alpha through Echo, a project that sounds almost purely administrative and delivers consequences that are anything but administrative. Taxiway performance is one of the least discussed and most operationally significant factors in how efficiently any airport actually functions day to day. When aircraft are held on taxiways waiting for sequencing clearance, the cost is not abstract or theoretical. It accumulates in real time, in burned jet fuel, in missed schedule windows that cascade into missed connections for passengers, in additional crew hours that airlines must pay for, and in gate conflicts that ripple through an entire day of scheduled operations across the airport. The cumulative drag that aging, undersized taxiway infrastructure has historically imposed on Norman Manley represents millions of dollars quietly lost, not to any single airline's bottom line, but to the aviation system as a whole operating through Jamaica, and by direct extension to the broader Jamaican economy that every one of those delayed flights ultimately serves. The rehabilitation introduces optimized taxiway alignment along with modern milling technology, designed specifically to reduce surface wear while simultaneously increasing safety margins for the heavier, larger aircraft the expanded runway is expected to attract in the coming years. As Kingston's runway extension opens the door to genuinely new European and Asian long-haul routes, the taxiways physically connecting those runways to the terminal buildings have to be capable of absorbing significantly increased ground traffic without creating brand new bottlenecks in exactly the places the old bottlenecks used to sit. This project exists specifically to make sure that ground capacity is already built and waiting before the actual passenger demand arrives, rather than scrambling to catch up after the fact. It is sequenced infrastructure in the truest sense, each individual piece quietly anticipating the piece that comes next in the chain. There is a reason airport engineers often say that a runway is only as good as the taxiway system feeding it, because a brand new runway attached to an outdated taxiway network simply relocates the bottleneck a few hundred meters, rather than eliminating it. $10 million is a small figure next to the price tags elsewhere on this list, but its return, measured in avoided delay and preserved schedule integrity, arguably outpaces several of the larger projects on a pure dollar-for-dollar basis. And while Jamaica's airports prepare methodically for that incoming volume of international traffic, The roads feeding the country's actual commercial capital are being rebuilt to absorb a surge of an entirely different and arguably even larger kind. Number 5. The Kingston Entrance Corridors Upgrade, a multi-billion-dollar investment into the arterial roads that ultimately determine whether a city can genuinely function as a regional trade hub or simply claim the title without the infrastructure to support it. For years, Kingston's entrance corridors have operated as a structural mismatch that anyone who commutes into the city recognizes without needing an engineering degree to explain it. Port traffic, commercial logistics vehicles, daily commuters, and heavy freight trucks have all been competing for the exact same narrow stretches of road, laid out in configurations originally designed for a city that in economic terms stopped existing decades ago. The congestion that results from this mismatch is not simply an inconvenience commuters grumble about over dinner. It is genuinely economically extractive, quietly draining productivity from every business dependent on timely delivery of goods, shrinking the effective working hours of every employee whose commute eats into their actual workday, and forcing every logistics operator in the region to run the numbers on whether routing cargo through Kingston is still worth tolerating the delay, or whether a competing port city offers a cleaner path. The upgrade brings enhanced road geometry, meaningfully widened lanes in the corridors that need it most, and intelligent traffic management systems capable of adjusting signal timing in real time based on actual measured flow conditions, rather than fixed schedules designed decades ago for traffic patterns that no longer exist. Anyone who has sat in a delivery truck idling at a Kingston intersection during rush hour, watching a signal cycle through timing that clearly has nothing to do with the actual traffic in front of it, understands intuitively why this upgrade matters more than its unglamorous name suggests. The less visible dimension of this project, the part that rarely makes it into a headline, is the planning intelligence embedded directly into its specifications. These corridors are not being sized for the traffic volumes Kingston generates today, on an ordinary weekday. They are being sized deliberately for the commercial volumes that the port expansion and the country's broader regional trade ambitions are projected to generate over the coming decades. Infrastructure built only for current need tends to become functionally obsolete the very moment it opens to traffic. Infrastructure built for genuinely anticipated future need becomes a durable competitive advantage from its very first day of operation, and stays one for years afterward. It is worth remembering that Kingston's port already handles a substantial share of transshipment cargo destined for other markets entirely. Cargo that never touches Jamaican consumers but generates real revenue simply by passing through efficiently. Every hour that a truck loses in gridlock on the way to or from that port is an hour a competing regional port did not lose, and shipping lines keep meticulous records of exactly which routes cost them the least friction. Yet even a capital city's arterial roads are ultimately secondary to the waterfront that defines its actual relationship with the sea, and that waterfront is undergoing a quiet reinvention of its own. Number 4. The Kingston Harbor Walk. 25 kilometers of coastline, $40 million, a single continuous corridor fusing commerce, tourism, climate resilience, and ecological preservation into one carefully sequenced project. The Harbor Walk connects downtown Kingston to Port Royal along a stretch of waterfront that has historically been significantly underused relative to its genuine economic and cultural potential. A length of coast that, for generations quite literally, faced away from its own city rather than toward it, treated as an industrial backdrop rather than a civic asset. The project is designed to reverse that relationship entirely, building both pedestrian and vehicular corridors that improve practical access to the port while simultaneously turning the waterfront into a destination people actively choose to visit, rather than a stretch of coastline they simply pass by on their way somewhere else. Maritime logistics, recreational public space, and tourism infrastructure are all being layered together in a design that treats the harbor as a strategic, civic, and economic asset, not merely an industrial boundary the city has learned to tolerate. What rarely gets mentioned in official descriptions of this project is the genuine sophistication of its environmental engineering. Every path, every bridge, every promenade along the 25-kilometer stretch is designed with rising sea levels already factored directly into the specifications, incorporating flood mitigation systems specifically intended to protect both the new infrastructure itself and the coastal communities living alongside it, communities that have historically borne the brunt of flooding with the least resources to recover from it. Local fisheries and marine ecosystems along the harbor were built into the design as assets genuinely worth preserving, not as obstacles to be quietly routed around during construction, a distinction that matters enormously to the fishing families whose livelihoods depend on waters that a poorly planned coastal project could just as easily have degraded rather than protected. The Harbor Walk is, in effect, an exercise in long-horizon thinking applied to public space, infrastructure that openly acknowledges the environmental realities of the next century, rather than deferring that reckoning for the political convenience of the next budget cycle. There is also a quieter civic dimension to this project that rarely gets discussed alongside the engineering specifications. A waterfront that residents actually want to walk along, rather than avoid, changes how a population relates to its own capital city. And cities that successfully reclaim neglected waterfronts elsewhere in the world have consistently seen surrounding property values and small business activity rise in the years following completion, effects that show up gradually rather than immediately, but tend to compound. That same forward posture, it turns out, is being applied to something far less visible than a public waterfront, the actual power source keeping Jamaica's busiest airport running through every kind of weather. Before we go further, if you're finding value in the level of detail most coverage of these projects leaves out entirely, take a moment to subscribe. This channel is working toward 10,000 subscribers, and every single person watching this countdown right now is genuinely part of getting there. Now, back to the list, because the final 4 projects carry consequences that reach well beyond Jamaica's own shoreline into how the country is positioned relative to its regional competitors. Number 3, the Norman Manley Solar Farm Phase 2. $8 million, 5 megawatts of solar generation, 8.1 megawatts of battery storage. A Caribbean international airport quietly rewriting its own operational DNA from the ground up. The significance of this particular project is most visible in exactly what it is designed to prevent from ever happening. Airport operations are relentless and fundamentally unforgiving of interruption. Flights do not pause politely for a grid outage to resolve itself. Cargo logistics, passenger processing systems, air traffic control infrastructure, and ground operations all require continuous, uninterrupted power with effectively zero tolerance for failure, at any hour of the day or night, in any season. Jamaica's electrical grid, like that of most island nations operating in hurricane-prone regions, carries an inherent structural vulnerability to weather events and general infrastructure stress, the kind of vulnerability that becomes genuinely existential the moment you are trying to run a functioning international airport through the middle of a tropical storm, when downed transmission lines and damaged substations can leave an entire region without reliable power for days at exactly the moment evacuation flights and relief cargo need that airport most. This solar farm, paired with substantial battery storage capacity, creates an energy buffer that insulates the airport from exactly that structural vulnerability, allowing critical operations to continue even when the broader grid is compromised. But the detail that transforms this project from a well-meaning sustainability gesture into genuine long-term strategy is its modular architecture. The system is specifically designed to expand in direct proportion to the airport's own growth, meaning the energy infrastructure scales alongside every passenger volume increase, every new international route, and every additional cargo operation that the other projects on this entire list are specifically designed to generate in the years ahead. This is not environmental messaging crafted for a press release. This is operational insurance, quite literally expressed in kilowatts, purchased in advance of the demand it is meant to meet. $8 million is a modest figure by the standards of this entire list. And yet the airports that have insulated themselves earliest from grid instability elsewhere in the hurricane belt have consistently recovered flight schedules faster after major storms than neighbors, who delayed that investment, a difference measured in days of lost operations, not hours. And as the airport methodically secures its own energy future, the port it serves is simultaneously securing something considerably larger in scope: Jamaica's actual position as a functioning node in global trade rather than a bystander to it. Number 2, the Kingston Container Terminal Upgrade. $80 million, transforming Jamaica's physical ability to handle the largest ultra-large container vessels now moving through global shipping lanes. Equipped with 14 hybrid straddle carriers and new ship-to-shore cranes capable of reaching across ships that, quite simply, did not exist a generation ago. The expansion of the Panama Canal introduced an entirely new class of container vessel into global trade. Ships too large for many established ports that lacked the physical infrastructure to receive them safely and efficiently. Vessels stretching longer than several football fields laid end to end, carrying cargo volumes that would have required 2 or 3 older generation ships to match just a decade earlier. Kingston's upgrade directly closes that specific gap, positioning the port to genuinely compete for cargo that has historically defaulted, almost automatically and without much consideration, to Miami or Port Everglades purely because those ports possess the physical capacity that Kingston, until now, simply lacked. The efficiency gains from hybrid straddle carriers and optimized terminal operations meaningfully reduce vessel turnaround times, and turnaround time is precisely the metric shipping lines actually use when deciding where cargo gets routed in the first place. Every incremental improvement in cost per container move, every hour shaved off time spent in port, quietly shifts trade flows in Kingston's favor, one shipping contract at a time. The terminal's physical footprint has not meaningfully changed in size. Its capacity and competitive position, however, have been fundamentally transformed. Beyond the pure mechanics of logistics, this upgrade carries genuine geopolitical weight that extends well past Jamaica's own borders. A faster, higher-capacity Kingston terminal strengthens Jamaica's influence over Caribbean and Central American trade networks at precisely the moment when global supply chains are actively diversifying away from single points of failure, favoring ports that have demonstrably invested in real physical capability rather than simply advertising a convenient location on a map. The effects of that shift will ripple through cargo volumes, formal trade relationships, and regional economic influence for years to come, extending well beyond the terminal's own gates and into how the entire region is perceived by global shipping alliances. It is also worth understanding what Kingston is directly up against. Miami and Port Everglades have spent decades building the kind of scale and shipping line relationships that do not simply transfer overnight because a competing port adds new cranes. $80 million buys Kingston a genuine seat at the table for the largest vessels calling on the region, but winning sustained cargo away from entrenched competitors will still come down to years of consistent execution, reliability, and pricing, not a single upgrade cycle. Which brings us to the smallest single investment on this entire list, and quite arguably the one carrying the most structural weight of all. Number 1. The Norman Manley Airport Wastewater Treatment Plant. $2.5 million, 60% complete, and quietly underpinning every single other expansion on this list, whether anyone involved in those projects realizes it or not. Here is the uncomfortable truth about aviation growth that rarely gets discussed in public. It does not happen in isolation from environmental compliance. It happens entirely within its boundaries, whether policymakers find that convenient or not, and whether the traveling public ever thinks about it at all. Passenger volumes and aircraft operations at Norman Manley are both rising at precisely the moment international environmental regulations governing airport operations are tightening, not loosening. The upgraded wastewater treatment plant exists specifically to ensure the airport can actually scale its operations while continuing to meet those tightening international standards. Standards that, if left unmet, do not simply produce fines, they produce the kind of reputational and regulatory risk that can quietly stall an entire growth strategy, regardless of how many runways or terminals have already been built and paid for. This modest plant, in effect, legitimizes everything else on this list. The runway extension, the apron reconstruction, the increased cargo operations projected for the years ahead, all of it ultimately depends on environmental compliance capacity keeping pace with raw operational capacity, and that is precisely why this project has been deliberately sequenced to complete in parallel with the others, rather than treated as an afterthought to be addressed once the more glamorous projects are finished. Without it, more flights simply means higher environmental risk, exactly the kind of risk that international regulators and trade partners do not tend to overlook indefinitely. No matter how much economic momentum a country has built, With it, the airport gained something considerably harder to quantify on a balance sheet than passenger numbers or cargo tonnage, genuine operational resilience that holds up under scrutiny. It is a strange kind of poetry that the smallest, least photogenic project on this entire list, a wastewater treatment plant costing a fraction of even the cheapest road corridor, is the one piece of infrastructure that international regulators and aviation partners will actually check before signing off on everything else Jamaica has built. Here is the honest picture once you step back and look at all 10 of these projects together, rather than one at a time. This is a multi-billion-dollar bet, financed through a combination of public investment, private capital, and international lending, and bets of this size inevitably carry real risk alongside real ambition. Caribbean infrastructure has a well-documented history of cost overruns, construction delays, and projects that ultimately underperform their own initial projections, and no genuinely credible account of this transformation should pretend those risks simply don't apply here. Debt taken on to finance this future has to be serviced regardless of whether tourism arrivals or cargo volumes actually hit their projected targets on schedule. And a government that has overcommitted on infrastructure spending has, historically, elsewhere in the region, found itself trimming social programs or delaying other priorities to keep those debt payments current when growth projections came in soft. Communities located along some of these corridors have raised entirely legitimate questions about land use, displacement, and whether the eventual benefits of these projects will genuinely reach the neighborhoods sitting closest to the construction, or whether those benefits will simply pass through on their way to somewhere else, leaving behind noise, dust, and disrupted access roads without a proportional share of the upside. There are also execution risks specific to a construction sector already stretched across 10 simultaneous mega-projects, a limited pool of skilled labor, specialized equipment, and experienced contractors being drawn thin across the entire island at once, which is precisely the kind of condition that has historically produced the delays and cost escalations this region knows all too well. None of this means the bet is a bad one. It means the bet is exactly that, a bet, made with real money and real communities' patience on the line. These concerns are not minor footnotes to an otherwise triumphant story. They are part of the real story itself, and any honest account of Jamaica's ongoing transformation has to hold both truths simultaneously: the genuine scale of the ambition on display, and the real weight of what it will actually take to deliver on it in full. What is clear, even accounting for that risk, is that these are not 10 isolated projects, simply competing with each other for headlines and budget allocations. A runway extension only matters in practice if the apron beneath the aircraft can actually handle the increased load it attracts. A container terminal upgrade only matters if the surrounding power infrastructure can run it reliably through every season. A solar farm only matters if the airport it serves is genuinely growing into something worth insulating from grid failure in the first place. Each project on this list quietly depends on at least one other project further down the list, forming something considerably closer to a single, interconnected national growth platform than a simple list of 10 separate construction contracts awarded in the same fiscal year. Individually, each of these projects is impressive on its own terms. Together, viewed as one continuous, deliberately sequenced strategy, they represent one of the most ambitious infrastructure transformations currently underway anywhere in the Caribbean basin, and one that regional competitors are, by every indication, watching very closely, because a Jamaica that can genuinely deliver on all 10 of these bets simultaneously does not just improve its own position, it resets the competitive baseline for every neighboring destination and port, trying to attract the same tourists, the same cargo, and the same investment capital. That is the part of this story that rarely gets said out loud. This is not only a story about Jamaica building for itself. It is a story about Jamaica attempting to change what the rest of the region has to compete against. Before you go, here is the question genuinely worth sitting with. Of everything covered on this list, which single project do you believe carries the most risk if it ultimately fails to deliver on its promise? The runway extension that Kingston's entire long-haul aviation strategy now depends on, or the container terminal upgrade that Jamaica is counting on to compete directly against Miami for global cargo contracts? Leave your answer in the comments below and tell us your actual reasoning, because the logic behind these bets matters just as much as the price tags attached to them, and we genuinely want to know which risk concerns you the most. 10 projects spread across 2 cities, touching aviation, shipping, roadways, energy, and the coastline itself, all moving forward at the same time on the same national balance sheet toward the same underlying goal. Whether every one of these bets pays off exactly as projected is genuinely something only the coming decade will settle. What is already certain is that Jamaica has chosen, deliberately and at real financial risk, to stop waiting for the region to change around it, and to start building the infrastructure that changes its own position within that region instead. If this kind of deep, unhurried look at the infrastructure actually reshaping the Caribbean is worth your time, subscribing helps this channel keep doing the research most outlets simply skip over entirely in favor of shorter, faster content. We're working toward 10,000 subscribers, and every one of you watching this sentence right now is genuinely part of that number. Thank you for spending this time with us, and we will see you in the next one.